At 3 a.m., in that vulnerable hour when defenses are lowest and emotions run highest, Sam's trembling fingers began typing a message that would undo weeks of spiritual restoration. Nancy, I have forgiven you. I know it is not your fault over what happened between us. His heart thundered in his chest as he stared at those words. The cursor blinked, waiting, tempting. In the dim light of his phone screen, his reflection showed a man teetering on the edge of a precipice he'd promised never to approach again. He paused, knowing he should stop. But in the darkness of his room, with Nancy's tearful confession still echoing in his mind, something broke loose inside him. A dam of suppressed feelings burst open, and words he'd kept locked away began to flow. You know, Nancy? His thumb hesitated over the keyboard. Warning bells rang in his mind, but they seemed distant, muffled by the loud beating of his heart. The delete button beckoned, his last chance to pull back from this dangerous cliff. Instead, he pressed on. I really felt something for you. From that very day you walked into that fellowship hall, I felt something. I got attracted to you. The words glowed on his screen, a digital confession of everything he'd been denying, everything he'd been fighting against in his prayers and fasting. The same fingers that had held his Bible hours earlier had now typed out the very thoughts he'd been battling to crucify. The send button pulsed like a heartbeat, waiting for his final decision. In this moment, all his progress, all his restoration work, hung by a thread. The photos in his recycle bin seemed to mock his weakness, as if they had known all along that this moment would come. His finger hovered over the send button, trembling with the weight of consequence. The soft swoosh of the sent message seemed to echo in Sam's dark room like a thunderclap. His heart stopped as he watched the double check marks appear, then turn blue, message delivered and read. Horror washed over him as the full weight of what he'd done crashed down. In a few seconds of emotional weakness, he had undone 3 weeks of spiritual restoration. His hands began to shake as he stared at his confession glowing on the screen, now impossible to take back. 3 dots appeared. Nancy was typing. Sam's throat went dry. The same room where he'd spent hours in prayer now felt suffocating. The Bible on his nightstand seemed to radiate accusation. He could almost hear Pastor Johnson's voice. Complete deliverance requires complete separation. The typing dots disappeared, then reappeared. Each second felt like an eternity. Then his phone screen lit up with Nancy's response. I knew it, Sam. I felt it too. I've been waiting for you to admit it. I'm still waiting. The words hit him like a physical blow. He could hear the familiar seductive tone in her message, the same one that had led to his downfall before, but this time he had walked straight into it, eyes wide open. More messages followed. I'm actually awake, and I'm alone. We could talk about those feelings you mentioned. Sam's finger hovered over his phone's power button, but he couldn't seem to press it. Like a man watching a train wreck in slow motion, he kept reading as message after message appeared. The digital clock on his phone changed to 3:33 a.m. The number seemed to mock him, half of 666. Everything he'd built back up over the past weeks was crumbling, and he had no one to blame but himself. A new voice note from Nancy appeared. With trembling fingers, Sam pressed play on the voice note. Nancy's voice came through, soft and intimate in the darkness of his room. Sam, I can't stop thinking about that day in your apartment. The way you held me, the way you tried to be strong, but we both know what we felt. I'm home alone right now and She paused, her breathing audible. I could really use someone to talk to face, just talking, nothing else. Unless ... Sam's phone slipped from his sweating hands onto his bed. His heart raced as another message popped up, an address. I'm just 15 minutes away, Nancy wrote, 1 taxi ride. No one would know. We could finally be honest with each other. The clock now read 3:45 a.m. Sam sat on his bed, his mind a battlefield. The 20 days of prayer and fasting seemed to evaporate in the heat of this moment. His thumb hovered over the address, 1 click away from ordering a ride. Just then, his phone lit up with another notification. His daily Bible verse reminder, watch and pray that ye enter not into temptation. The spirit indeed is willing, but the flesh is weak. The verse hit him like a bucket of cold water. In that moment of clarity, Sam saw the familiar pattern unfolding again. The late-night messages, the emotional manipulation, the suggestion of an innocent meeting that would lead to anything but innocence. But this time was worse. This time he had initiated it. His confession had opened a door that all his prayers and fasting had been trying to keep shut. His phone buzzed again. Nancy had sent a photo. The photo showed Nancy in her bedroom, obviously taken moments ago. She was sitting on her bed, wearing what looked like the same red outfit from that day in his apartment. Her eyes held that same vulnerable yet inviting look that had started his downfall. "Just one visit," another message popped up. "We both need closure." Sam's fingers moved across his phone screen almost on their own, opening the ride-sharing app. The estimated fare to Nancy's address blinked at him. His thumb hovered over the Book Now button. Suddenly his phone screen went black. The battery had died. In the abrupt darkness, Sam sat frozen. The silence in his room seemed deafening. For the first time in hours, his mind was forced to stop reacting and start thinking. He fumbled for his charger, plugging in the phone with shaking hands. As he waited for it to restart, his eyes fell on his reflection in the window. The streetlight outside illuminated a face he barely recognized. Eyes wild with desire, sweat on his brow, the face of a man about to throw away everything for a moment of pleasure. His phone chimed back to life. Messages from Nancy flooded in. "Sam, are you coming? I'm waiting. Don't leave me alone like this." But something had shifted in those few moments of darkness. The battery dying had been like a divine intervention, a forced pause in his headlong rush toward destruction. With surprising steadiness, Sam's fingers began to type. "Nancy, I was wrong to message you. Wrong to confess those feelings. Wrong to open this door again. I'm blocking this number and deleting these messages. Please don't try to contact me again. I will be praying for your healing, but I cannot be the one to help you." Before he could change his mind, he pressed send. Then, with tears streaming down his face, he opened his recycle bin and permanently deleted every photo of Nancy. One by one, he blocked her on every platform: WhatsApp, Facebook, Instagram. As the first light of dawn began to creep through his window, Sam fell to his knees beside his bed. For the first time since his restoration began, he prayed with complete brokenness. "Lord," he whispered, "I'm not strong enough. I never was. Help me." As morning light filtered through his window, Sam's initial relief began to curdle into doubt. The weight in his chest hadn't lifted. If anything, it had grown heavier. He sat on his bed, staring at his blocked contacts list, second-guessing everything. "Did I just make a terrible mistake?" he whispered to the empty room. His mind began to twist his actions into knots of guilt. Not guilt for messaging Nancy, but guilt for abandoning her. A voice in his head, smooth and reasonable, began to reshape the narrative. If God really wanted you to break up with Nancy, why would he allow her to reach out? Why would he let her share such a painful testimony? Those other preachers, they were the real villains. They took advantage of her. But you actually care about her soul. The more he thought about it, the more his late-night confession seemed less like a failure and more like honesty. Wasn't God a God of truth? Hadn't he just been expressing his genuine feelings? "Maybe," the voice continued, "this is God's way of bringing healing to both of us. After all, didn't Jesus associate with those whom the religious leaders condemned?" Sam's eyes drifted to his phone. The action of blocking Nancy now felt harsh, even cruel. He had promised to pray for her healing, but wasn't that just a spiritual-sounding way of washing his hands of her pain? His recent spiritual high from prayers and fasting began to feel hollow, artificial. The voice in his head grew stronger. "You're not like those other preachers. Your feelings for her are pure. You could be different. You could be the one to show her what godly love really looks like." The delete button on his blocked contacts list seemed to pulse with possibility. The knock on his door shattered the morning silence like a thunderclap. Sam's heart leapt to his throat, expecting Pastor Johnson or his mother, the only people who would visit this early. Instead, there stood Nancy, the physical manifestation of all his internal struggles. "Can I come in?" Her voice was barely above a whisper, thick with emotion. She stood there in that familiar red sleeveless dress, the same one from his saved photos, the same one that had haunted his dreams. Tears glistened in her eyes, threatening to fall. Sam stood frozen in his doorway, his mind spinning. All his carefully constructed barriers, the blocks on social media, the deleted photos, the stern final message, all rendered useless by her physical presence. His mouth opened, but no words came out. Taking his silence as permission, Nancy gently pushed past him into his apartment. The scent of her perfume, the same one that had lingered on his shirt weeks ago, filled the small space. She sat down quietly on his couch, the same spot where their first counseling session had taken place. The morning sun streaming through his window illuminated her tears, making them look like diamonds rolling down her cheeks. She sat there, waiting, vulnerable, yet somehow in complete control of the situation. Sam stood by the still open door, his hand gripping the handle. His Bible lay open on his bed from his earlier prayers, its pages stirring slightly in the morning breeze. The distance between his door and his couch seemed to stretch for miles, each step towards Nancy feeling like a step away from everything he'd been fighting to rebuild. She patted the space next to her, an invitation that felt more like a test. Sam sank onto the couch, his eyes fixed on the floor, acutely aware of Nancy's presence beside him. The morning light caught the cross hanging on his wall, casting a long shadow across the room. Suddenly, Nancy slid to her knees before him, tears streaming down her face. Each tear seemed to fall with the weight of lead, hitting the floor like accusations. "I'm sorry, I'm so sorry," she sobbed, her composed seductress persona cracking into something that looked remarkably like genuine remorse. "It was all a mistake, and it happened so fast," she continued, her voice breaking. Her hands reached for his, and Sam felt his resolve wavering. The touch sent electricity through his body, awakening feelings he'd been fighting to bury. The morning sun highlighted the tear tracks on her cheeks, and Sam found himself torn between the pastor he was supposed to be and the man he was trying not to be. Her red dress seemed to glow in the sunlight, a warning sign he was choosing to ignore. His phone lay on the coffee table, the screen still showing his Bible app's verse of the day. "Watch and pray, that ye enter not into temptation." But watching Nancy on her knees before him, seemingly broken and repentant, made all his spiritual warnings feel distant and theoretical. Her hands tightened around his, drawing him closer. "You're different," she whispered, echoing her messages from the night before. "You actually care." The space between them grew smaller, charged with dangerous possibility. Nancy gently touched Sam's cheek in an attempt to make Sam to look into her eyes directly. Sam's feelings grew much stronger and uncontrollably. The sleeveless gown on Nancy exposes the body, and the lit gown she wore made it impossible for Sam to reside. Sam quickly stood up and held her hands to raise her from her knees. But immediately Nancy stood. Her breath intensified along with Sam's. Sam gripped her by her waist, and Nancy dipped his lippus into her lips, and the rest of the time was filled with passionate love encounters. Hours later, Sam sat alone in his room, the weight of what had happened crushing him. The morning sun had given way to afternoon shadows matching the darkness in his soul. His fellowship badge lay on the floor, along with his Bible, both silent witnesses to his fall. The sound of the chapel bells in the distance felt like judgment bells tolling. Today was supposed to be the final day of his restoration period. Instead, he had fallen deeper than before. This wasn't just a moment of weakness or an inappropriate conversation. This was a complete surrender to everything he had been fighting against. His phone buzzed with a message from Pastor Johnson. "Sam, looking forward to our final restoration session tomorrow. God has been faithful in these 21 days, hasn't he?" The message felt like a knife to his heart. How could he face his mentor now? How could he stand before God? The gravity of his actions settled over him like a heavy shroud. Nancy had left hours ago, with a satisfied smile that now haunted him. She had won, completely and utterly. Her conquest of another spiritual leader was complete, and this time, the fall had been total. The end. Please subscribe to my YouTube channel to receive more of this kind of story. Thanks.